The origin of this Warboss was an attempt to improve my Plasticard skills. There are some absolutely incredible Plasticard built Warbosses out there, and my use of Plasticard by contrast is pretty limited. Also, it's always kind of bugged me that most of my Warbosses aren't as power armored as they could be, and primarily that's because finding the exact right piece to look integrated is hard. The Plasticard Mega Armor process I'm going to be using in this video is owed to a post on the Daka forums, which I'll link in the description, and you should definitely go read in full if you plan on creating your own Plasticard Mega Armor. I've always really loved this Blood Bowl Black Orc. It has a great pose, filled with bristling strength and menace, but unfortunately his clothes are very clearly football styled. This was kind of perfect for this project though, as I knew his Mega Armor would cover it all up. The only other problem is that for my first foray into Plasticard, I didn't want to start with something so small. If only there was a bigger version. Oh, there we go. That's better. I started by slicing off the portions of the Blood Bowl Orc that stuck out and would get in the way of layering on armor, and we'd be covered in the end anyway. Following the steps of the tutorial I mentioned, I started by cutting out a sheet of Plasticard for a Crotchal Plate after measuring it against the Orc, and then gluing it in place. Next came a Plasticard dowel I snipped down in length and glued to the lower back of the Orc to form the axle that his leg pistons would attach to. Beneath it, I glued another armor plate. For the feet, I cut down a sheet of PVC to raise him in height a little and form the soles of the armor shoes I was going to be giving him. To create those, I cut out a length of thin Plasticard and glued them in a box around his feet. This looked pretty silly, but I knew I'd need to just push through and not judge his shoebox feet until his legs were done. Next, I cut and glued a board of thicker Plasticards to the front of his shins. At the bottom, I cut a crescent so they'd fit against the top of his feet snugly. I intentionally waited until it was glued in place before cutting it down to size, as I'm lazy and hate measuring things. Though not necessary, I cut squares of Plasticard and glued them to the knees of the Plasticard board to mimic the look of the original Mega Knob armored legs. I repeated the steps on the other leg until I had a matching pair. To create the pistons that lie over the thighs of the Orc, I used two different diameter Plasticard dowels. These ended up being a complete pain to connect. They don't fit exactly one in the other, so I instead used a paper clip to connect them. The problem with that is that the diameter of the paper clip also doesn't quite match the inside of the dowels, so I ended up using Procreate to fill the insides and then push the paper clip in, but it still moved around a little too much. In the future, I'm just going to cast the pistons from the Orc bits and use those. The tutorial I was following had the pistons attached from the knee to the axle at the lower back, but I quickly realized that because of the motion of the left leg, that angle wasn't going to work with this Orc. To fix it, I heated and bent the axle down to circle the back of the Warboss so the angle would be better. The legs weren't entirely done, but I decided to start on the main body of my Orc's Mega Armor anyway. To create a breastplate, I cut out a trapezoid of Plasticard. The thing about Mega Armor is that it's intentionally very boxy, so this kind of flat plate doesn't look out of place like it might on a Space Marine, for example. I glued it in place, then snipped down his left pauldron so I could fit more Plasticard above it. Measuring it against the Orc, I carefully cut a crescent out of it so it could fit atop the breastplate at a right angle. I glued it in place and did the same to the other side. At this stage, I glued in place a double-sized Orc Head from Puppets of War to make sure that the armor wouldn't get in the way I would eventually want it posed. I adjusted the armor where I needed to, then glued in place the head and a board connecting the two shoulder struts. Torso worked out, I went back to the legs of my Warboss and attached an armor board to the outside of the shin. I didn't like how the bent lower back axle was looking, so I took it off and replaced it with a straight one. Instead of trying connecting the pistons to the ends, I instead connected a side thigh plate to stretch from the knee joint. I then added a little shelf of Plasticard to make it look like the piston attached directly to the board. Ironically, this is how the official Mega Knob leg armor works to begin with. This is the point in the build where I started to veer away from the tutorial and the Plasticard idea as a whole. The tutorial gives the Mega Armor big wings like pauldrons, but I wanted something a little more compact and boxy, so I instead cut into the original pauldrons and replaced them with the pauldrons from Aquila Can. I could have made these out of Plasticard, but it would have taken longer and had less detail. And by this point, I was confident enough in my Plasticard ability that I didn't feel the need to make my Warboss 100% Plasticard. The point of forcing myself to use Plasticard was to build up the skill, not to adhere to it rigidly. Next, I cut out the back of the Warboss and glued in place the back half of the reactor from the old Gaz model, which is nicely wiry and busy. I also cut off the front of my Warboss's feet and replaced them with those of a Death Dread, which made him look significantly less derpy. I also at this point started gluing in place bolt heads I had made using Procreate and a mold. Technically, I'm doing this wrong, since really they should be smaller, more of them, and attached to the edges of each Plasticard plate. But that would have been even fiddlier, and honestly, I kind of like how the big, chunky bolts look. The armored fists of the original Meganob kit aren't large enough for my Warboss, so I instead created one out of PVC and Plasticard. I cut off the original right arm before starting this project, but I glued the replacement hand at the same angle it had been at. I mentioned before I hate making orc gun arms, and this time was no exception. I eventually settled on just layering on the gun from an orc vehicle, and then on top of it half the gun from a Leviathan dreadnought. This didn't look half bad once I glued on some greebles to flesh the hand and forearm out, but did look hilariously oversized. To remedy it and make it more plausible than my Warboss could heft what's essentially an anti-aircraft gun, I connected it to the torso of the Mega Armor with a trio of pistons. This was way overkill and hid the muscles of the arm, but I dug the look of it. It's powerful and orky, and the pistons are almost muscle or tendon-like. I'd planned on adding this power claw to the left arm of my Warboss, but the problem is that it's too long and hits the ground. I could have modified it or made one from scratch from Plasticard, but I had the idea instead to have him dragging this dead Marine. Ever since my chonky cyborg build a little bit ago, I've been trying to add a little more of a story or diorama-like quality to my builds. In the case of this Warboss, I especially like the idea that he's dragging a butchered Marine with him to maybe throw before some Imperial fortification to shock and lower their morale and promise the slaughter to come. A bit reminiscent of Achilles dragging Hector behind him on his chariot around Troy. I started prepping the Marine for his death by snipping off his leg and damaging his armor. The reason for snipping off his leg isn't just to show damage, it's also to hide how clearly his stance is originally of someone standing, and also to make it so the leg wouldn't stick out too far and go off the base once the Warboss was glued to it. I would eventually replace this Marine with another, but I essentially damaged him in exactly the same way. I'd wanted to use the model's original hand to drag the Marine, but the pose of the fingers just doesn't look plausible, so I decided to replace them with this fist from the Age of Sigmar Giant kit. To make it look like it was grabbing the Marine's collar, I carved the collar almost entirely off. You can't see what's inside a closed fist, and I knew I could sculpt any of his armor I needed to back later. You can see here that the effect was pretty good. It's not perfect. It looks better from the front and side than the back, and looks less like he's dragging the Marine than slinging him forward, but I was relatively happy with it. One issue though was that my Warboss was looking a little lopsided, having one mega armored arm and one bare. I'd originally been thinking of adding pistons between the shoulder and this Plasticard brace, but it didn't really work visually because it hid all of the muscle detail. Ironically, I ended up going the other direction and lowering the profile of his left pauldron by replacing it with this Kilocan one at a more downward angle. This works better and helps focus attention on the Marine he's dragging with his swole arm. My Warboss was nearly done but required just a few details to his armor. The biggest change was that I redid his breastplate so it tucked in a little more at the waist, then used Procreate to sculpt inside so it looked less like a plate of armor and more like an integrated piece. And with that, my Plasticard Warboss was done. While he's not perfect by any means, I'm extremely fond of him and proud how he turned out. Especially the interaction with the Marine I think brings him to the next level. As the build went on, I definitely drifted away from the original goal of using Plasticard, but I still think it looks good where I did use it, and more importantly, I feel a lot more confident in using it in orc builds going forward. If you liked this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out some of the other massive orc warbosses I've made in my Building Bigger Orcs playlist. Thanks for watching.